Goal that catches your attention. You just feel like you have to talk about it. Well, I just dealt with that just now with this article from Inverse. 30 years ago, one SNES horror side scroller was the end of an era. This wasn't the greatest Castlevania game ever, but it was very accessible. Okay? It really caught my attention when I saw the picture. I knew exactly which Castlevania game it was. I have it. In fact, I have all of them that were released in America. This is Dracula X on the Super Nintendo. This is a very, very not so well made port, which is essentially its own game, of Rondo of Blood, which is on the PCEngine, which is the Japanese version of the TurboGrafx 16, but specifically it's the PCEngine CD-ROM. So let's read this article, shall we? The idea of using a whip to defeat undead demons, vicious skeletons, and bloodthirsty vampires never gets old. While the Castlevania franchise has been around in some way, shape, or form since 1987, by 1995, video game aficionados have plenty of experience with the various plot lines and formats of this gothic premise. In a way, Castlevania as a whole deserves a decent amount of credit for popularizing the idea of badass vampire slayers and making old school Dracula battles feel like something that could be easily fused with martial arts. Okay? There are a handful of games that were made that dealt with, monsters and demons and whatnot. Even back then, you can go as far back as stuff like Mad Monster Party, for instance. Bandai had a fair share of games, not necessarily good ones, but they had Frankenstein, they had Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, had movie tie-ins like Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street. Obviously you had Castlevania, you had games on the Atari like Haunted House, you had a few stuff. It wasn't necessarily just Castlevania. Hell, even like uh, Splatterhouse, for instance. There's definitely a few out there. So let's continue. But on July 21st, 1995, when Castlevania Dracula X was released for the Super Nintendo, it garnered both cheers of celebration among younger gamers and a bit of a shoulder shrug from older gamers. And in its split, that a crucial truth about various 1990s SNES games can be found. The critical darlings of the time weren't exactly the same as what kids gravitated towards when playing games. Although many critics of Castlevania Dracula X complained that PC version of the game was better, for most young people, this was the coolest and most fast-paced version of the Castlevania franchise yet. Okay, full stop. PC version of the game was better. So there are a couple, actually maybe one or two Castlevania games on the PC. Specifically, there's an MS-DOS version of Castlevania. If you go with the Japanese PC systems like the MSX2, Castlevania was ported onto that, and it was its own version. The Sharp 68,000, I think, was a computer system in Japan, which was another, port of, basically a remake of Castlevania 1. Dracula X was not on the PC. The PC, personal computer, and the PCEngine are two vastly different things. When I read that, I had to do a double take. The person who wrote this article apparently doesn't know the difference between the PCEngine and a computer. So, okay, let's keep reading. Oh. Like previous versions, the player controls one of the Belmont heroes. Oh my god. In this case, Richter Belmont, who is a a descendant of Simon, Ostensibly, your primary motivation as Richter is to fight and whip your way through hordes of undead to rescue your girlfriend Annette and her sister Maria from Dracula's clutches. Technically, this narrative, as well as the gameplay, is a remake of Rondo of Blood, which was previously released for CD-ROM for PCs in 1993. Again, this is wrong. It was not made for the computer. It was made for the PCEngine. You should have just put down the TurboGrafx 16 or the Japanese version of the TurboGrafx 16. It never got released in America until much, much, much later. But this statement is absolutely wrong. Do your research. But for kids, the difference between a 1993 computer game, not a computer game, the PCEngine, is a console. It's the TurboGrafx 16. And a 1995 SNES game is a very big gap. Yes, the N64 was on the horizon, but in 1996, for most kids in 1995, the SNES was still the best gaming system you could get, and that meant that badass side scroller in which you destroy undead enemies with a whip was still fairly amazing at the time. So let me tell you a story about Rondo of Blood. I remember hearing about it much later. By the time I heard about it, the game was very obscure. I knew about Castlevania 4, Super Castlevania. I obviously knew about the original trilogy. And then I knew about Symphony of the Night. Hell, I even was vaguely familiar with Bloodlines. I did not know about this game until I was well into high school, which was years later. I got lucky and I picked up a copy. Oh God, it must have been back in 2008, 2009 for about $70, which was a lot for the time, but hell, nowhere near as much as how much it's going for nowadays. But yeah, I thought it was cool, but I definitely wanted to play Rondo of Blood, but unfortunately, aside from emulation, that wasn't really possible until we got the Dracula X Chronicles, and it was finally translated. However, you had to unlock the game by finding it. But yeah, this is definitely inaccurate, and I'll tell you, it plays way different. It's not necessarily a bad game, and the reason why I liked it to an extent was because it's the prequel, a version of the prequel to Symphony of the Night, but it is no Rondo of Blood by any means. The problem with Dracula X is that at the time it was essentially playing the greatest hits of Castlevania games up to that point, which means that today the playability is basic at best. I don't know if I'd go that far. It's definitely Rondo of Blood is definitely the better game, but I don't think it's necessarily playing the greatest hits. I find this Dracula X to be actually harder than Rondo, but some people have said the opposite. In fact, I don't know if I've ever beaten Dracula X for the SNES. I know I've beaten Rondo of Blood a few times. Now, definitely, Rondo of Blood was an homage to the series in general, with all the bosses that you fought. But I don't know if necessarily Dracula X was like that. Let us continue. Yes, there is still a novelty to this kind of side-scrolling game, but sometimes it's hard to believe this game was released just a year before N64 and 2 years before Symphony of the Night was released for the Sony PlayStation. So this game honestly doesn't look bad at all, and I will say the sound design was better in terms of like the sound effects versus the music. So the music for Rondo of Blood was great. It was absolutely stellar. I have the soundtrack on vinyl. Definitely sounds much better than the Dracula X soundtrack, but the sound design, those sound effects that the SNES comes up with, just hit way better than what the TurboGrafx 16 could offer. It's just there's no comparison. They use the same sprites for Symphony of the Night as they did with Rondo of Blood, and same thing with this game. They use the same sprites for it. Honestly, I'd say if you get a chance, play both at some point. They're fairly easy to get. Well, yeah, no, they're fairly easy to get a hold of. I'll explain that later. In a sense, Castlevania was never destined to be a great arcade-style classic Nintendo game. Instead, as the critics of the time, its best form tends to exist as slightly more complex PC game. Wait, hold on, let me reread that. In a sense, Castlevania was never destined to be a great arcade style classic Nintendo game. Instead, as the critics of the time, its best form tends to exist as slightly more complex PC. What? This this is written so weird. So, if you're gonna play Castlevania on the SNES, you gotta play Castlevania 4. It's peak Castlevania. In most cases, people are either gonna say Symphony of the Night's the best game or Castlevania 4 is the best game. Castlevania 4 plays perfect. Play that. Looking back, Dracula X was not the greatest Castlevania game of all time. Of course, it's not the greatest Castlevania of all time. You can make an argument that even Rondo wasn't the greatest Castlevania of all time. Uh, Honestly, Dracula X is one of the weaker ones, but it's not the worst. I would say Haunted Castle still dog shit. Castlevania The Adventure was awful. Uh, you know, but Dracula X was okay. Honestly, that's probably the worst thing to say. It was okay. It was kind of boring. Wasn't really as well made as some of the other games were later. And even before, honestly, if you think about it. But for a brief time before Symphony of the Night amped up the graphics and gameplay in '97, it amped up the graphics not that much because they used the same sprite. The gameplay obviously was different because it was more of a Metroidvania, which honestly this was the game that really popularized that type of genre because it was all about exploration. The game ran smoother and it was a more explorative game, and it definitely took longer to play and beat. It wasn't necessarily about time jumps. One thing I liked about Castlevania, Dracula X, and Rondo of Blood was the fact that you could branch to different paths depending on what you take, which was really nice. I think that may have been the first one that did that. I could be wrong, but I think Rondo of Blood and then Dracula X were really the first one that did that. I don't think the Bloodlines did that. Well, okay, no, I take that back. Castlevania 3 did that too. Um, yeah, you can take different paths, but they did it really creatively in Rondo of Blood and Dracula X. Actually, specifically, what was kind of cool about Dracula X, there's a spot, I think it's in level 2 or 3, you can literally fall off an area and you go right to the next level, but an alternate version of it. Anyway, enough of my rambling. Let's continue on. Yeah, gameplay 97. This was the most mainstream Castlevania game for the vast majority of people. I disagree. If it was that mainstream, the game would not be as expensive as it is. The game is like $200 to $300. This is not the most mainstream Castlevania game. Are you serious? You can pick up a copy of Castlevania 4 for maybe $40, $50. They sold plenty of copies. They hardly sold shit when it came to Dracula X. The most mainstream Castlevania game for the vast majority of people. Even by 1996, it's very very kid automatically had a PlayStation or N64. Not like very kid automatic. Oh my god. Proofread your shit, dude. For many kids stuck with their SNES, which by the way, good on you if you had an SNES, because there's some great games on there. In 1996, you could have been playing Chrono Trigger, Mario RPG, Secret of Mana, oh my god, Donkey Kong Country 1, 2. I mean, I guess 3's good, 2 in its own right, but definitely 1 and 2. Killer Instinct, there's so many good games that came in the later life of it. Super Mario World 2 Yoshi's Island, great game, well made. Oh god, stuck with their SNES. Dude, looking back, the SNES was so good. It was like the N64 was definitely a downgrade in my opinion. Not that it was bad, but my god, with the amount of stuff that we had on the SNES, just stuck with their SNES, whatever. Castlevania was the best you could do in this franchise. There are other really great games on even the SNES that was more of a horror themed, but definitely on the Genesis. There's some good shit on the Genesis. You just had to look. And I just, wow. Its legacy is simply that, the people's version of an incredible franchise and a throwback to simpler time in gaming when watching that magic whip extend out into a straight line was thrilling enough to keep you mashing the buttons. Mashing? You don't really mash buttons when you're playing Castlevania. Did you play this shit? Castlevania Dracula X is available to play on various emulator sites, including retro game. Oh my god. Okay. Let's do this right. You can get Castlevania Dracula X by purchasing a digital copy of the Castlevania Advance Collection on pretty much every system you can think of. PS5, PS4, Xbox One, Xbox Series X, and Nintendo Switch. I have a physical copy because I liked it that much. But yes, you can still purchase this digitally. You don't have to go to an emulator to get it. You had to before because the game was just not available. But that is not the case now. The person who wrote this article should not be advertising emulation when it's a game that you can still legally purchase. I'm sorry. Wow, who wrote this? Who wrote this? I don't know who wrote this. But my god, proofread your shit. You could have wrote this so much better. Wow, that is just wow, I've been on this for 20 minutes. This was bad. This was a bad article. So here's my take on Dracula X. It's okay. I had a lot of interest in it because I loved Symphony of the Night. And I was like, oh, Richter had his own game. That's cool. And then when I did more research, I'm like, oh, Richter had an even better, more elusive game that we just didn't get released. And then it made me want to look for it. Back in the day when we just didn't have a way to get it, I emulated it. And then I got a copy of Dracula X. And then Dracula X Chronicles came out on the PSP. I bought that. I unlocked that shit. I had so much fun with Rondo of Blood. I rarely played Dracula X on the SNES ever again, I'll be honest. But I have it because, I wanted to collect everything. But wow, this article sucked. Sorry, whoever wrote this, but my God, do better research and proofread, and don't advertise that you can emulate this, because obviously, yeah, you can, but you really, this is available to get. Konami is giving you the opportunity to actually, pay, what, $15 to get that and three amazing games on the Game Boy Advance versus paying $300 to get a physical copy. You know, it's definitely worth the price. So, yeah, that's all I had to say about it. Oh my God. It's ridiculous.